Welcome to the video for Chapter 18 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about athematic verbs. The present stems of all the verbs that we've looked at so far have ended in a, the so-called thematic vowel. So, for example, to form a class 1 present tense stem, I take a root, put it into guna and add an a. So, for example, from per I get para. Class 4, I take a root, leave it in 0 grade, and add ya. So from hirsch, I get hirschja. Class 6, I take a root, leave it in 0 grade, and add a. So from lik, I get lika. Class 10, I take a root, either leave it in 0 grade or put it into guna or virti, and add aya. So for example, from chur, I get choraya. All of these forms end in a. The remaining 6 verb classes that Sanskrit has and that we yet have to look at all are athematic, meaning that their stems do not end in a, do not end in this thematic vowel. Another feature that they have in common is so-called vowel gradation, also known as ablaut, of the stem, which means the following. They have 2 stems, a strong stem and a weak stem. The strong stem is used in the active singular, in the present and imperfect. The weak stem is used more or less everywhere else. The strong stem will have an element in guna, and the weak stem will have that same element in 0 grade. So, for example, of the verbal root I, meaning to go, we get the first plural form I mach and the first singular form e mi. The endings should already be familiar to you, mach in the first plural and mi in the first singular. But what's new is what's happening in the stem. And the stem in the weak forms, i.e. in the dual and plural, consists of just the root in 0 grade, whereas in the strong forms, so in the singular, the stem consists of the root in guna. 0 grade vowel I turns into guna e, and it's to these stems, I in the dual and plural, and e in the singular, that we then add our endings, mach and mi, giving us imach and emi. Like thematic verbs, the various athematic verb classes differ in what is added to the root, or what is done to the root, in order to form the present tense stem, and so we need to look at each of these verb classes individually. But before we do that, let's just briefly look at the endings that all athematic verbs use. The endings that you see here, mi, siti, wach, tach, and so on, should be fairly familiar to you because they're the same endings that we've also seen in the thematic verbs, except there, of course, the endings were always preceded by a in the first persons or a in the second and third persons. So we had a, mi, asi, ati, a, wach, atach, and so on. Here, we don't have this a or a, we have just mi, siti in the singular, wach, tach in the dual, and in the plural we have mach, ta, and not what we might expect, nti, but here in the plural we do get an a at the beginning of the ending, and so the third person plural ending is anti. So let's begin looking at the individual athematic verb classes. First up is class 2, and class 2 verbs have their endings added directly to the root, and there are no further affixes. So, for example, of the root I, to go, which we just saw, we have a first singular e, mi, I go, and a first plural I, mach. So again, what is happening here is that it's the root itself that is put into guna in the strong forms, i.e. the singular, and is left in the 0 grade in the weak forms, i.e. in the dual and the plural. So the strong stem would be e, the weak stem would be I, and to that we then add our endings, mi and mach for the first singular and first plural respectively, giving us e mi and I mach. Next up, class 3 has something called reduplication that we're going to look at systematically in just a second. So class 3 verbs reduplicate the root. They do not add any other affixes, and it's the root that is in guna in the strong forms and in 0 grade in the weak forms. So, for example, of the root hu, to sacrifice, we get a first singular juhomi and a first plural juhumach. These 2 forms consist of ju, which is the reduplicative syllable, which, as I said, we're going to look at in just a second. Then ho and hu, which is the root in guna and in zero grade respectively, and the endings mi for the first singular and mach for the first plural. So reduplication, let's take a closer look at it. Reduplicating a root means taking the first consonant and the first vowel of that root, putting them together and adding them to the beginning of the root. So for example, of the root taksh, which means to construct or to fashion something, we get a reduplicated form ta taksh. What happened here was that the first consonant, t, and the first vowel, a, were taken, repeated or reduplicated, and added to the beginning of the root, and so from taksh we get ta taksh. Unfortunately, there are a number of formal irregularities in this process of reduplication. Some concern the vowel that's reduplicated, most of them concern the consonant. Now, as far as vowels are concerned, short vowels are reduplicated just identically, as we just saw, a was reduplicated as a. However, long vowels are reduplicated with their short counterpart. So, for example, of da, to give, we get the reduplicated stem da, da. The d is just reduplicated as it is, and the a is reduplicated in its short counterpart, so we don't get da, da, but we get da, da. As for the consonants, aspirated consonants are reduplicated without their aspiration, so of the root dha, to put, we get the reduplicated form da, dha. So what happened here was that the d, which is the initial consonant of this root, was reduplicated not as d, but as d, i.e. without aspiration. The a, the vowel, was reduplicated, but as its short counterpart. And so the reduplicative syllable is da, which is added to the beginning of dha, giving us da, dha. Next, velas are reduplicated as palatals. So, for example, from the root gup, to defend, we get ju gup. What happened here is that gup begins with g, which is the voiced, unaspirated vela. Velas get reduplicated as their palatal counterparts, and so g is reduplicated as the voiced, unaspirated palatal, and that is j. And so the reduplicative syllable is ju, and the whole form is ju gup. Now h is reduplicated as j. What's happening here is that h often originally was, at an earlier stage of the language, not a h, but actually a gh. So it was the aspirated, voiced vela. Now aspirated consonants get reduplicated without their aspiration, and velas get reduplicated as palatals. So this voiced aspirated vela gets reduplicated as the voiced unaspirated palatal, and that's j. So hu, to sacrifice, which we just looked at, is reduplicated as ju hu. Consonant clusters at the beginning of a root reduplicate only the first consonant. So, for example, of krum, meaning to stride or to walk, we get cha krum. What's happening here is that only the k is reduplicated, not the r. And k is a vela. Velas are reduplicated as their palatal equivalents. And k is the unvoiced, unaspirated vela, which is reduplicated as the unvoiced, unaspirated palatal, which is ch. And so we get cha krum. The exception to this exception is if the consonant cluster at the beginning of a root contains a sibilant, sh, sh, or s, plus a stop, then it's not the sibilant but the stop that is repeated. And so, for example, of stub, to praise, what we reduplicate is not the s but the t, and then we reduplicate the vowel, giving us tu plus stub. But then, because the reduplicative syllable contains an u, and u causes ruki, so the retroflexion of s to sh, we then get not tu stub, but tu stub. If you found all these new details a little overwhelming, A, you're right, and B, you're in good company, because most people, when they're first faced with reduplication, react that way. But don't worry, it is only going to get easier from now. The remaining verb classes always have the root in the same form, and in each class a different affix is added to the root, and it's the affix that then is strong or weak. Class 5 verbs, which are up next, add the suffix no in the strong forms and nu in the weak forms, and they add that after the root. So for example, from ab, to obtain or to get, we get a first singular ab no mi and a first plural ab nu mach. So what we get here is the root ab in both forms, both the strong and the weak. And then in the strong form, we get no with the guna vowel o added. In the dual and plural, we get weak nu added with the zero grade vowel u. And then we just have our endings. So for first singular, that would be mi, and first plural, that would be mach. There's one formal irregularity in class 5 verbs, and that is that the u at the end of first dual and first plural forms may be dropped in verbs whose roots do not end in a consonant, or basically remember it as it may be dropped in some verbs. So for example, from ab, to obtain, to get, we get just the first dual ab nu wach and the first plural ab nu mach. However, from ver, meaning to cover, we get both ver nu wach and vern wach, and plural ver nu mach and vern mach. So what's happening here is that because ver ends in a vowel, we have these two alternative forms, one that contains the u and the other one that doesn't. Both of them are fairly straightforward to pronounce. Note that we have a little bit of internal sandhi here, which is the retroflexion of n to n. This is something that we first saw in chapter 6 and which we're going to look at more systematically towards the end of this chapter. Next up, class 7. Class 7 roots add na to the strong forms and n to the weak forms, but they add this into the verbal root, and specifically they add this directly before the root final consonant. What does that look like? Well, for example, of rud, meaning to hinder or to obstruct, we have the final consonant dh, and it's in front of this dh that strong forms add na and weak forms add n. So we here get a first singular runadmi, again with a change from n to n, and a first plural rundmach. So again, it's before the final consonant of the root, in this case dh, that strong forms add na and weak forms add n. Class 8 roots add o in the strong forms and u in the weak forms, and they add this after the root. So for example, of tan, meaning to stretch or to extend, we get a first singular tan o mi and a first plural tan u mach. So here we get again the root in a form that doesn't change, it's just tan. And then in the strong form we get guna o added, and in the weak forms we get zero grade u added, and after that we simply get our endings that we already know. So for example, in the first singular tan o mi, and in the first plural tan u mach. Just like in class 5 verbs, the u at the end of the first dual and first plural stem may be dropped, so there are alternative forms tanu wach and tanwach, and tanumach and tanmach. Different forms, same meaning. Most existing class 8 roots, of which there are actually not that many, end in n, and so effectively they look identical to class 5 verbs whose stems don't end in n, but they add an n plus an o in the strong forms and an u in the weak forms. Class 9 roots, finally, add na in the strong forms, ni in the weak forms whose endings begin with a consonant, and n in the weak forms whose endings begin with a vowel, which effectively means the third person plural. They add this after the root. So for example, from ver to choose, not to be confused with ver to cover, which was class 5, ver to choose, which is class 9, has a first singular vernami, a first plural vernimach, and a third plural vernanti. Again, we have internal sandhi here, namely from dental n to retroflex n, and that's actually the next thing that we're going to look at, internal sandhi in athematic verbs. And let's actually begin with the n that we just looked at. Now n in front of a vowel can change into retroflex n. The exact details for how this works were introduced in chapter 6. In a nutshell, if you have a preceding R, so either consonantal or vocalic, or a preceding sh, a retroflex S in the same word, then a dental N can change into a retroflex N. This happened, for example, in singular forms that we've seen, such as runadmi or wernami. N in front of another consonant, on the other hand, cannot be affected by this, but rather it turns into the nasal corresponding to that consonant. We've seen this in a couple of dual and plural forms. For example, in class 7, if we look at rud, then the first dual of that is rundwach. So even though there is an R preceding, the N does not change into a retroflex N, because it is followed by a dental D, and so it just remains a dental N in front of the dental D. However, if an N is inserted in front of a consonant that isn't a dental, it turns into the nasal that goes with that consonant. So for example in yuj, meaning to link, we get a first dual yunjwach, and what's happening here is that in front of the palatal consonant j, the N changes into the palatal nasal ny, and so we have yunjwach. In classes 2, 3, and 7, there is no suffix after the root, either because in class 2 there is nothing added apart from the endings. In class 3 we have just the reduplicative syllable before the root, or in class 7 we have something added into the root. So in all three of these classes there is nothing added after the root, which means that if any of these roots end in a consonant, then that root final consonant comes in direct contact with any stops or with the S that can stand as the first sounds of verbal endings. So for example, in front of S, so in front of si, the second person singular ending, we can get loss of both voice and aspiration. So for example, in rud, to obstruct, we have a second singular runat si. What's happening here is first of all that the N that is inserted into the root is retroflected. So rather than having runatsi, we have runatsi. And then secondly, the D in front of the S loses both its voice and its aspiration. D is the voiced aspirated dental, and so it turns into the unvoiced unaspirated dental, which is T, and so we have runatsi. And yes, if you take a step back and for a moment don't look at these as technical grammatical terms anymore, then something losing both its voice and its aspiration is rather tragic. But that's the power of internal Sandhi for you. Now, loss of voice or aspiration is possible before stops. So for example, chid, to cut, which is also class 7, so also adds na and n, has a third singular chinat-ti, where the d at the end of chid becomes voiceless in front of the t that begins the third person singular ending t. T is voiceless, and in front of this voiceless t, d also becomes voiceless, so chinat-ti. Then if we have a sound that is both voiced and aspirated standing before a stop, what happens is that we get Buddha Sandhi, which was introduced in chapter 8. So for example of rud, again to obstruct, we have a third singular runad-dhi. So here we have not just the N becoming retroflected to N, but also the voiced aspirate losing its aspiration. So from D we get D. And also passing on both voice and aspiration to the T that follows. So instead of an ending T, we have an ending Dhi. And so the form as a whole is runad-dhi. Then finally, we once again have palatals appearing as velas in front of a consonant or in front of S. And so from watch, to speak, we get a third singular wak-ti. And finally, in the second person singular forms, where the ending is si, we have many instances of the S changing into retroflex sh, according to the rookie rule, which was introduced in chapter 9. So for example, in class 2, we don't get e si, but we get e shi. Class 3, not juho si, but juho shi. Class 5, not ab no si, but ab no shi. Class 8, not tano si, but tano shi. So whenever you see this shi, remember it's just the same as C. Once again, you have been introduced to a whole lot of new information, and once again the question is, how do you best familiarize yourself with all that? And as always, there are several ways. So for example, you can look at the table in the book that contrasts all the paradigms on one page. Or if you go in for corny mnemonics, then here's one for you. Nothing is added in class 2. Reduplicate 3, juho, juhu. In class 5, add a no and a nu. In class 8, it's just o and a u. Na and n are added into. Class 7, class 9, last of the crew, adds na, ni, n, and that should do. If you find this sort of thing helpful, then do just memorize this mnemonic. Another practical aspect of being able to identify athematic verbs when you see them on the page, in an exercise, in a text, and so on, is to be able to recognize forms in spite of all their internal sandhi. So, be able to recognize retroflex N's for dental N's, retroflex S for dental S, unvoiced instead of voiced sounds, unaspirated sounds instead of their aspirated counterparts, velars instead of palatals, and so on. If you find this a little difficult, then go back to chapter 2, where the system of Sanskrit sounds was first introduced. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!